Sunday nights at the Marlowe Room always carried a kind of stillness that wasn't silence so much as anticipation, a dense atmosphere like cigarette smoke drifting through the velvet-covered chairs and warm amber lights, curling along the spine like all the words people never said aloud. I felt it the moment I stepped behind the long mahogany bar, my hands still clinging to the scent of citrus and old bourbon from the half-finished cocktails. The Marlowe Room sat deep within Seattle's Capitol Hill district, tucked inside an old red brick building that had witnessed far too many lives pass through and held too many secrets in quiet trust. The walls whispered if you stood still long enough to listen. For the past 8 months, I had been part of that whisper, silent, precise, unseen, and I liked it that way, until the night he walked in. Everything I had spent years trying to forget rushed back, sharp as the metallic tang of blood in a glass of gin over ice. My name is Claire Dalton, 27 years old, a bartender, a survivor. I was never the type to stand out, brown hair tied low, a neat black shirt, hands always busy, eyes always watching. I loved the rhythm of this bar, the steady cycle of glasses, polite smiles, the clink of crystal, the old jazz humming from the corner. Regulars at the Marlowe were mostly people who didn't want too many questions. Businessmen, politicians, occasionally the kind of person whose name you wouldn't find on Google, yet their presence could quiet an entire room the moment they crossed the threshold. That night, Seattle rain fell hard, streaking the windows with long, broken reflections of streetlights. I was wiping down the counter when the heavy wooden door swung open. A gust of cold air swept in, carrying the damp breath of the storm and the tall, shadowed figure of Marcus Layton. He was not someone you overlooked. A charcoal gray suit tailored to perfection, a black tie, eyes sharp as a blade. But it wasn't his appearance that made people hold their breath. It was the absolute silence around him. Every sound in the room seemed to pull back. No one looked at him directly, yet every tilt of a head, every breath, shifted when he walked by. Marcus wasn't just the owner of the bar. He owned an entire chain of restaurants, lounges, and hotels stretching from Seattle to San Diego, someone people whispered about under different names, though none were ever spoken to his face. I knew I shouldn't look at him too long. But that night, I did. And what I saw wasn't just a powerful man. In his eyes, deep, quiet, cold, I recognized something familiar. A loneliness I had seen before. In the mirror, in my brother's eyes before he disappeared. I lowered my head, continued polishing the glass. The surface was icy beneath my palm, and my heartbeat slipped out of rhythm. Something had shifted. I couldn't name it, but I knew this night was not like the ones before. If you're listening to this and you feel something in this story tug at a part of you, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories every day. And if you don't mind, tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We cherish every word you share. Marcus Layton did not sit in the usual VIP section. He chose the high-backed stool at the far end of the bar, where the light dimmed just enough for him to watch the entire room without drawing too much attention. I handed him a glass of aged scotch without needing to ask. It was one of the first things I learned at the Marlowe. Some people didn't want conversation. They only wanted you to remember exactly what they liked and to know when to stay silent. Marcus accepted the drink with the slightest motion, barely brushing near me, yet enough to send a cold ripple beneath my skin. He didn't look directly at me, only surveyed the ebb and flow of guests, his fingers steady around the glass with a composure so controlled it bordered on emotionless. His face was handsome in that austere way, strong jaw, straight nose, dark brows, gray eyes like Seattle's sky before rain. But it was the stillness in those eyes that held me. Not ordinary coldness, but a thin layer of ice held tight beneath steel, as if one wrong touch could shatter everything. Others watched him with reverence, caution, even fear. Men in suits toasted from a distance. Staff walking past dipped their heads slightly, like they were brushing against the edge of a silent storm that could break at any moment. But what I felt first when I looked at Marcus was not power. It was solitude. Not the kind that comes from being abandoned, but the kind carried by people who gave up on being understood long ago, who accepted standing alone in a world they no longer trusted. There was a moment when I caught him staring at the fogged-over glass door, his gaze drifting far, as if searching for something lost ages ago. And in that moment, I saw myself reflected in him. someone who had also lost a piece of herself, someone who moved quietly inside a shell, letting no one close. I turned away quickly, heart stumbling, silently scolding myself for letting anything slip. He was the boss. I was just a bartender. I had no right to look too long. But from that night on, every time Marcus appeared, I watched him a little more closely. The way he nodded slightly to the few people he respected, the way he never drank more than 2 glasses in a night, the way he always left before the final song. He moved through the world like it was a vast chessboard, never revealing his hidden pieces. Yet buried beneath that absolute control, I noticed the faintest fracture, like a jazz note that falls half a beat off, leaving the listener uneasy. I didn't know what I was searching for in him. Maybe the truth. Maybe a missing piece that could help me understand my brother's death. Or maybe, for the first time in months, I felt there was someone out there who was just as lost as I was. And somehow, in a strange, quiet way, that made me feel a little less alone. I always carried with me an old leather-bound notebook whose spine had cracked and whose edges had faded to a soft, worn gray. To anyone else, it was nothing more than a place where I scribbled cocktail recipes, reminders from management, or a few harmless notes about customers. But the truth was that inside it lived the fragments of what remained of my brother, Jamie Dalton, who died 2 years ago in a robbery the police described as no evidence, no witnesses, no suspects. A conclusion cold and tidy enough to close a file, but nowhere near enough for me to accept. Jamie was not the kind of man who died by accident. He was an investigative journalist who lived by suspicion and died for the truth he uncovered. I remember the last evening we saw each other. It was raining then, too, just like tonight. Jamie walked into the coffee shop where I worked at the time, soaked through, hands trembling but eyes blazing with excitement. He pushed a thick envelope toward me, told me to keep it safe, and that I was not to open it unless something bad happened to him. I laughed, thinking he had gotten himself tangled up in another one of his big exposés. He always had that look, as though danger was the only stimulant strong enough to make him feel alive. A few days later, I got the call that he'd been shot dead in the garage of an abandoned building in the south end of the city. Police said it was a robbery gone wrong. But Jamie had no wallet on him. His phone was still there, and his car sat untouched with the keys left on the driver's seat. I opened the envelope he had left behind. Inside were printouts of encrypted emails, lists of names, diagrams of bank accounts, and one name circled in ink so dark it bled through the back of the page: Nolan Beckett. The name meant nothing to me then, but months later, when I began working at the Marlowe Room, I realized it was far from unfamiliar. Nolan was a senior manager there, the kind of man who always wore a perfect smile, always remembered every employee's birthday, and always knew how to make you feel seen. And because it was all so perfect, I began to feel afraid. I couldn't be sure whether Nolan was directly involved in Jamie's death. All I knew was that my brother had been investigating a money laundering operation tied to a chain of high-end restaurants and hotels along the West Coast, and part of that trail seemed to lead straight toward the Marlowe Room. From that day forward, I began writing everything down. Who entered the VIP rooms, the nameless guests who arrived with bodyguards, phone calls Nolan took late at night before stepping outside, strange shipments delivered that never passed through the official inventory system. I was no investigator, just a younger sister who refused to let her brother be reduced to a forgettable headline on an online news site. There were nights I thought I was losing my mind. Nights I dreamed of Jamie standing by the roadside, drenched in rain, looking at me with the same sadness he had on that final night. But every time I thought about giving up, I opened the old leather notebook, read what I had written, and remembered I still owed him one truth. And if that truth was buried here, among the powerful, beneath the shadows tucked behind crystal lights and the nightly clink of glasses, then I would find it whatever it took. Nolan Beckett was the kind of man people liked instantly. He knew every employee's name, remembered every regular's favorite drink, smiled at just the right moment, and said exactly what people wanted to hear. But the longer I watched him, the more that smile seemed too smooth, too practiced, like something rehearsed in front of a mirror 100 times. The first notes I took on Nolan were small, seemingly harmless details. One night, I saw him slip into the basement through the staff entrance, a door usually used only for early morning deliveries. When I gently asked if something was wrong, he laughed and said he was checking the cooling system, but I knew the maintenance schedule, and his shift wasn't part of it. A few weeks later, a shipment of liquor arrived that never went through the main storage room. No invoice, no signature. Wooden crates sealed shut were sent directly to the VIP lounge via the private elevator. I stood only a few steps away, watching Nolan inspect them himself before shutting the door the moment an employee asked if he needed help. I didn't dare get any closer. I simply wrote down the truck's license plate, the delivery time, and the date in my notebook. I began paying attention to his phone calls. Every time his phone rang, Nolan stepped out of public areas, usually to the third-floor balcony where cameras didn't reach and smoking was forbidden. When I happened to go up there to clean, he always hung up abruptly and turned away. Once, I caught the tail end of a conversation, his voice dropping low, almost hissing the words, "Settle it before morning." Then came the sound of a glass shattering. I pretended not to hear anything, but when he walked back in, the look in his eyes made my skin crawl. That was no longer the pleasant manager everyone admired. That was the gaze of a man willing to do anything to protect his secrets. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. But I also knew that if Nolan had anything to do with Jamie's death, every thread of truth I needed began with him. I started adjusting my work schedule to overlap with his. I recorded the days he arrived early, the nights he stayed late, who met him in the private meeting room, and the familiar faces that appeared during his shifts. I couldn't ask anyone. I couldn't trust anyone. There was only the leather notebook and my own eyes. Once, I accidentally heard Jamie's name in a whispered conversation between Nolan and a stranger with a distinctly southern accent. They spoke softly near the bar with their backs turned, but the name Jamie Dalton sliced through the air like a cold blade. I froze, gripping the bar towel until my nails pressed crescent marks into my palm. After they left, I stepped closer, searching for anything left behind. On the table was a folded piece of paper, one corner marked with 3 hastily scribbled words in blue ink, Delta Holdings Limited. I spent the entire night searching that name when I got home. An offshore company in the Cayman Islands. No clear address, no listed director, but it had appeared once before in the documents inside the envelope Jamie gave me before he died. The threads were beginning to connect. It was no longer a vague suspicion. Jamie had uncovered something deeper, darker, and Nolan was not just a charming manager, he was part of that darkness. I didn't know what I was getting closer to. All I knew was that the deeper I went, the louder Jamie's voice echoed in my mind, a warning, tender and desperate all at once. Don't trust what you see on the surface. That night, Nolan suddenly asked me to bring a tray of liquor up to the 3rd floor, where there was a private meeting room reserved only for appointments never written on the official schedule. Normally, Darren or one of the senior staff would handle something like that, but this time he turned to me, his eyes lingering just long enough to make me lose my breath for a second before he gave a small nod, as if weighing the odds of a gamble. I couldn't refuse, not when I was still trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, trying not to reveal that I had been tiptoeing through a web of forbidden things. I prepared the tray with a bottle of the most expensive Macallan and 3 crystal glasses so thin the light passed through them like fractured ice, then stepped into the elevator with the keycard Nolan had tossed onto the bar. The doors opened to a short hallway, carpeted in thick red velvet, lit dimly, carrying the faint smell of expensive tobacco mixed with old oak. I had never been up here before. The room at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, muffled voices drifting out just loud enough to catch. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, keeping my face as unreadable as possible. Marcus sat in the main chair at the head of the table, leaning back with the ease of a man who belonged there. Nolan stood to his right, resting lightly against the chair, holding an unlit cigar between his fingers. The third man was someone I did not recognize, but the cold eyes and dark suit made it clear he was not the kind of guest who visited the lounge for entertainment. They were discussing something, words clipped and sparse, like shorthand for a financial exchange. When I entered, none of them looked up right away. Only when I set the tray on the side table next to Nolan did he glance at me with a slight nod, signaling me to leave. But Marcus's eyes met mine, and he did not look away. His gaze slid over my skin like the edge of a blade, not enough to draw blood, but sharp enough to leave a chill. Nothing explicit was said, but I knew he had noticed something, maybe the tension in my hand, or the flicker of suspicion I hadn't been quick enough to hide. I turned to go, but the voice of the third man made me pause. His voice was rough and deep, carrying the weight of someone who had once commanded others. "You're sure your girl doesn't know anything?" I didn't hear the response, only silence. a silence heavy as lead, followed by the long, slow pour of liquor, sounding like a crack forming beneath the surface. I left the room with my heart pounding, forcing myself to walk evenly down the hallway without looking back. The door clicked shut behind me, but the man's question echoed in my mind like a warning blow. Your girl doesn't know anything. I had no idea what they were discussing, but the air inside that room told me I had stepped into a place where secrets were not allowed to leak. And what frightened me most was Marcus's gaze. Not because it was angry or suspicious, but because it was deep enough that I couldn't tell whether he was protecting me or probing me as part of whatever chess game he was quietly playing. I returned to the bar and wrote down every detail I could remember: the seating arrangement, the bottle they opened, the stranger's question, and Nolan's reaction. That night, the rain fell again. I stood behind the bar, wiping the same glass for the 5th time, staring at the streaks of water sliding down the window. A part of me wanted to walk away, burn the notebook, pretend I didn't know anything. But I had gone too far, seen too much. And from the moment I stepped into that room, I knew I was no longer just an outsider. The following morning, while I was polishing the crystal glasses on the rack, Seattle's weak sunlight filtered through the rain-streaked windows, casting faint lines across the wooden floor. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation in that room, about Marcus's eyes and the stranger's chilling question. But just as I was piecing together those scattered fragments, the wooden door behind the lounge opened, and a man stepped inside. The stranger walked in with Nolan, looking tired and irritated at being dragged out so early, his trench coat soaked, his graying hair neatly trimmed. I turned instinctively, and for a brief, piercing moment, my heart stopped. That face, the narrowed eyes, the slightly crooked nose, the small scar beside his left lip. I had seen him before, not at the Marlowe, but in an old photograph. One of the photos Jamie had shown me months before he died, taken covertly during a secret meeting between men he called the link between money laundering and political influence. Jamie had pointed at this man and said he never signed his name on any transaction, but he was present at every major meeting, and if anyone held the key to unlocking the inside door, it was him. I couldn't recall his name, but I could never forget his face. And now he was here, right in front of me, speaking casually with Nolan as if they had known each other for years. I lowered my head, pretending to wipe the counter, but my hands stiffened, my breath coming fast and shallow. Nolan laughed, patted the man on the shoulder, then turned to signal me to prepare 2 double espressos, no sugar. I did as I was told, my mind spinning with every worst possibility. If Jamie had been right, if this man was at the center of the underground network he was investigating, then his presence at the Marlowe was no coincidence. And Nolan didn't just know him, he was working with him. When I brought the coffees to their table, I tried not to look directly, but my eyes drifted to the man's left wrist. There, just above the cuff of his sleeve, was a faint tattoo. A small circle with 3 intersecting lines, a symbol Jamie had once circled in red in his notes, calling it the emblem of the underground trading group tied to Delta Holdings. The loose threads of the past months tightened around my throat like a noose. Nolan was the connector. This man was the bridge between Delta and everything Jamie had uncovered. My hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped the cups. I hurried back to the bar, opened my notebook, and wrote everything down. The tattoo, the arrival time, the way they addressed each other, the heavy East Coast drawl in his voice. Everything matched, frighteningly, with what Jamie had warned me about, and I realized coincidence had long run out. There was no doubt left. Jamie had not died for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been watched, targeted, and possibly murdered for knowing too much, and the man standing only a few feet away from me was part of that truth. When I looked up again, I saw Marcus enter the room, standing still at the far end, his gaze lingering first on Nolan and the stranger, then, for a moment too long, settling on me. It felt like he was reading my thoughts, or worse, gauging how much I already knew. I lowered my head, swallowed the rising panic, and wrote one more line in my notebook. He is the man in the photograph. Jamie was right, and if I wasn't careful, I could be next. I left my shift that night with a tightness in my throat, the kind that made every breath feel strangled by the fragments of truth that had just detonated in my mind. It was still raining, the wind slapping against my face as I burst through the back door of the Marlowe, my shoes slipping on the soaked pavement. I couldn't stay another second, not with Marcus's gaze cutting through my thoughts, Not with the man bearing the tattoo of the organization that killed Jamie sitting less than 10 meters from where I stood. I needed air. Distance. Time to piece together the details screaming inside my head. I ran all the way to my small apartment 3 blocks from the Marlowe, locked the door behind me, then slid down to the floor as if finally allowing myself to collapse. I had gone too close, too deep, and I was terrified. But I didn't realize that in my frantic escape, I had left behind the most important thing I possessed, the leather notebook. It wasn't in my bag, not on the counter, not in my coat pocket. My stomach dropped to the floor when I felt that strange emptiness. I tore through everything, opened the trash, lifted the cushions, rummaged through the drawers, checked my backpack 3 times, but its absence sliced through me like a blade. I tried to remember the last moment I held it. The image was clear, me writing down the final notes about the tattoo, then setting it beneath the bar when Marcus walked in. I hadn't taken it with me. I had left it, there, at the Marlowe. And if someone found it, if Nolan read it, if any of them discovered what I had been writing, it would be like signing my own death warrant. I ran back immediately, sprinting across the empty streets with the rain punishing my face, my heart pounding as though it would burst. But when I arrived, the doors were already locked. I didn't have access for the night shift. I stood there, drenched, my hands shaking as I called Darren, pretending I had forgotten something personal. But he didn't answer. I couldn't break in, couldn't make a scene, so I returned to my apartment and stayed awake the entire night, eyes glued to my phone, waiting for a text, a call, anything. But nothing came. The next morning, when I stepped into the Marlowe, my heart seemed suspended in midair. Everything looked normal, too normal. No one mentioned the notebook. No one asked me anything. But as I walked past the bar, the place where I remembered leaving it was empty. And then I saw Marcus. He was standing at the far end of the room, where the light spilled gently through the heavy velvet curtains, holding something made of dark brown leather. The notebook. I froze, unable to hide the fear flashing through my eyes. Marcus didn't say a word. He just looked at me for a long time, then quietly set the notebook on the side table as if it were nothing more than a misplaced menu. But his eyes were not as cold as before. In that flicker of a moment, I saw something else. Not accusation, not quite sympathy, more like recognition, as if he had just read a secret he understood better than anyone. I stepped toward it slowly, as if every footstep might trigger an explosion. Marcus still didn't speak. I placed my hand on the notebook, my fingers trembling when they touched the cool leather. I wanted to ask how much he had read, but I didn't dare. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, but carrying a subtle tremor I couldn't name. "Claire, do you have any idea what you're stepping into?" I didn't answer. I only met his gaze, waiting to see whether I would be drowned or saved. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Permanently. Marcus didn't say anything more that morning. He simply left the notebook on the table and walked away, leaving me standing alone behind the bar with my heart racing and 100 unspoken questions. I didn't know how much he had read, but I knew for certain he knew. The things written in those pages weren't the kind you skim. They were the words I had written through sleepless nights, the pain I had never spoken aloud, and the clues leading to Jamie's death. Marcus didn't return all day, but near the end of my shift, Nolan appeared still wearing that familiar calm smile, though this time something in his eyes chilled me to the bone. He approached the bar and placed a neatly folded piece of paper before me. I opened it. One single line. 3rd floor office. 1900 hours. At the bottom was Marcus's signature, swift, sharp, decisive. I couldn't refuse, and I knew this was not going to be a casual conversation. I was 5 minutes late, not on purpose, but because I had stood outside the door for nearly 10 minutes trying to slow my heartbeat. When I finally pushed it open, Marcus was standing at the window, his back to me, the city lights reflected faintly against the thick glass. In that moment, he looked like a figure carved from cold, stone, silent, unreadable. He didn't turn when I entered. The door clicked shut behind me, making me flinch. The room was so quiet I could hear the echo of my footsteps on the wooden floor. The notebook lay open on the table, turned to the page where I had written about the tattooed man and the notes on Nolan. Marcus spoke without looking at me, his voice low and steady, like wind slipping through a narrow crack. "You write with detail, precision, and recklessness. I clasped my hands behind my back to steady myself and pressed my lips together. I didn't intend for anyone to read it. I forgot it. He turned only when I finished speaking. His face wasn't angry, not at all. It carried something far more serious, something old, like he had seen this before, lost something because of it, and was now trying to stop it from happening again. "Claire, who do you think Nolan is?" I couldn't answer. I didn't dare. He walked slowly to the table and tapped the page with his finger. "This. If it fell into the wrong hands, you wouldn't just lose your job, you could lose your life." I met his eyes, straight on. "Do you know who Jamie Dalton is?" A beat of silence. Marcus held my gaze, then gave a slight nod. "I know. And I know he didn't die by accident." My breath caught at those words. My fingers curled tightly, my voice trembling. "You read everything, didn't you? You know all of it now." Marcus didn't respond right away. He walked around the table, sat down, his hand resting on the notebook's cover, as though debating whether to close it or push it toward me. "Claire, I met Jamie. Once. Before he died, he came to me." I couldn't stop the sharp gasp that escaped me. "Why?" "He wanted my help exposing Delta Holdings. He knew he was being followed, but he kept investigating, and he left part of the data with me. I assumed he had sent everything else to you." I shook my head, barely above a whisper. "He only gave me an envelope. He never explained anything." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then what you're holding is the missing half. I have one piece, you have the other. Put them together, and it becomes undeniable evidence linking Nolan, Delta, and the high-level officials behind them." My heart hammered. I gripped the table just to stay upright. Marcus watched me for a long time, then spoke again, his voice softer than before, no longer that of a distant boss but of someone who had lost something himself. "If you intend to continue, you can't do it alone. I'll help you. But I need to know, how far are you willing to go?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but my answer came without hesitation. "I've already lost Jamie. I won't let his death disappear into silence." Marcus nodded once more, slow and resolute. "Then we begin here." Marcus stood after my vow, walked to the cabinet in the corner of the room, opened a hidden drawer, and pulled out a small wooden box. He placed it between us and unlocked it with a tiny key he wore around his neck, as if it were something he never allowed out of his sight. Inside were several portable hard drives wrapped carefully in black cloth, each labeled by hand in sharp, meticulous handwriting. "These are the copies of what Jamie gave me. The rest is in your notebook. Put them together, and we can expose the entire financial route behind Delta Holdings. But it's not just about money. It leads to an entire network of power politicians, police officers, judges." Jamie nearly succeeded, but they killed him before he could publish it. I sat silent, my eyes fixed on the drives as if they held my brother's ashes, the last pieces of him I had never known. Marcus closed the box and pulled it toward himself. "I can't do this alone, Claire. I need you. Not just because you hold the other half, but because you're the witness. You're the only person who has observed Nolan's interactions with the people involved, and your notebook carries more weight than you realize." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. "You mean, giving testimony? To whom?" Marcus looked straight at me, without a flicker of hesitation. "To the Council of 12. An underground tribunal that operates parallel to the official legal system handling matters like this in the dark, but with no less severity. I've been investigating Nolan for over a year. I can't go public, he has eyes everywhere, but the council is strong enough to take him down if we have evidence, and you're the key." I went still, the room fading around me. I thought of Jamie, of the sleepless nights he spent hunched over documents, of the last time he hugged me and said if anything ever happened, I couldn't let it all disappear. I took a deep breath, looked at Marcus, and fought to steady my voice. "If I agree, what can you guarantee?" He reached into the drawer again and pushed an envelope toward me. Inside were documents for a new identity and a bank account under the name Claire D. Monroe, already funded with enough money to start a new life anywhere I chose. "If things spiral out of control, you'll have a way out." I stared at the envelope, then at him. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Jamie once pulled me back from a bad decision. I never paid that debt. This is the only chance I have to do the right thing. And you're more like him than you think." A tight ache pierced through me, not of fear, but because for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone in this fight. I nodded, slowly. I'll do it. But I want to stay until the very end. I want to see him exposed. Marcus nodded and extended his hand. From tonight on, you're no longer just a bartender in a high-end lounge. You're a witness. And I will make sure you survive long enough to tell the whole story. I placed my hand in his. The handshake not forceful but firm enough to tell me I had stepped into a world where there was no turning back. The moment I agreed, Marcus didn't let me return to my usual life at the Marlowe for even a single night. He took me to a safe house in the north of the city, tucked behind an old bookstore that looked utterly ordinary from the street. Inside was something entirely different, minimal, discreet, arranged like an underground training center. There were no words of comfort, no soft reassurances. Everything began that very night. Marcus wasn't the one to train me. He handed that responsibility to a woman named Evelyn, around 40, small in stature but with a voice that could silence an entire room. She had once been a legal advisor for a federal agency but withdrew after a case that never saw the light of day. Evelyn looked at me as if measuring and cutting a suit, not caring how frightened I was, only whether I could stay steady when questioned before the Council of 12. We began with psychological drills, enduring extreme pressure, maintaining composure in confrontational dialogue, practicing breath control to mask emotion. Then came the simulations. Evelyn reconstructed the council chamber with cold wooden chairs, harsh lights, and echoing acoustics. She played the roles of every council member, each with a different style of interrogation. The blunt, the icy, the honeyed voice whose every word hid a sting. She never held back. Every hesitation, every wavering answer meant starting over. In the early days, I wanted to quit. My mind spun from the influx of information. My palms sweated each time I stepped into the training room. My throat tightened whenever I spoke of Jamie, of Nolan, of the pages I had written in my notebook. But as days passed, I realized Evelyn wasn't shaping me into someone who recited a flawless statement. She was forging a truth that couldn't be shaken. She taught me how to hold a gaze, how to pause at the right moment so listeners leaned into the words, and most importantly, how to tell the truth without letting fear warp it. Marcus appeared occasionally, only to observe, never interfering. But each time he stood there, I felt a heavier weight, an unspoken pressure, not of suspicion but of trust. And trust, I sensed, was not something he gave easily. One night, after a 2-hour simulation, I sat alone in the small kitchen, my hands still trembling from recounting how Jamie had been followed before disappearing within 24 hours. Marcus walked in, didn't ask questions, poured 2 glasses of water, and sat across from me. After a long silence, he said, "The council won't be easy to convince. They've lived in the shadows long enough to tell who speaks from conviction and who speaks from fear." I looked at him, exhausted but resolute. "I have nothing left to lose." Marcus nodded gently, his hand resting on the table, not touching mine, just a gesture of grounding. "Then you'll do it. Because people with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous." The next morning, Evelyn brought me into another sealed room. On the table lay a full summary of the case photos, connection maps, financial documents, encrypted recordings. She looked at me one last time before I began studying them. The day of reckoning was approaching, and once I stepped into the circle of the Council of 12, there would be no way back. The hearing was held in an old mansion on the edge of Lake Washington, a place without cell signal, without cameras, without nameplates, nothing identifiable except for a towering black iron gate and walls covered in dense creeping vines. The car carrying Marcus and me stopped just as dusk settled, the last rays of daylight slicing through the tree canopy like thin blades, scattering speckled patches of light across the ground. I wore a simple black outfit, my hair pulled tight into a bun, my hands cold despite how tightly I had clasped them all the way there. Marcus hadn't spoken during the entire drive, but when the car came to a stop, he turned to me with eyes sharp as a drawn blade. "If any question shakes you, remember why you're here." The heavy wooden doors opened with a low groan, revealing a long hall draped in deep red carpet, the chandelier light falling like a dead, moonlit glow. Evelyn was already waiting, no smile, no greeting, just a nod, before she led me down a long corridor and into a circular room with a vaulted ceiling where 12 dark wooden chairs were arranged in a crescent. In front of them stood a small platform for the witness, more reminiscent of an ancient rite than a modern inquiry. I stood there, spine straight, eyes fixed on the thick, unmoving air. Ahead, listening to the footsteps echo one by one as the council members entered. No one introduced themselves, they didn't need to. These were people who had spent half a lifetime in the shadows, delivering judgments capable of collapsing empires or plunging entire cities into crisis. Some were retired judges, some former federal agents, some orchestrators of hostage rescues never made public. But they shared one trait. They were not here for money or power. They were here to ensure that the most dangerous truths were neither buried nor lost in the whirlpool of ambition. The air was so dense I felt as though I were breathing through thick cloth. Each council member sat without a signal, their gazes slicing across me like blades, testing the steadiness in my eyes. Marcus stood behind me, not touching, not speaking, yet his presence anchored me, kept my legs from trembling. A tall, silver-haired woman with eyes cold as a winter lake spoke first. She tilted her head slightly, her voice clear and measured, each word cutting through the silence. "You are Claire Dalton, keeper of the journal left by the victim, Jamie Dalton. You are the last living witness capable of confirming the link between Nolan Beckett and Delta Holdings." I nodded. "Yes, I am." She glanced around, then leaned forward, as if invoking something old and solemn. "Then begin with the moment you realized Jamie did not die in a robbery, but because he touched what he should never have known." I drew a deep breath, my mind blank as a fresh page. But my heart knew exactly what story must be told. And for the first time, in a room where darkness overshadowed power, Jamie's voice would finally be heard through me. I began speaking, my voice trembling at first, then gradually steadier, each word laid down like the stones of a path leading me out of the same swamp that had swallowed Jamie. I spoke of the nights he sat at our kitchen table, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, still scribbling notes under the warm light, his thin hands trembling from fear. I spoke of the envelope he handed me before he disappeared inside, only a few blurred documents, a map of transactions, and pale blue ink circling the name Nolan and Delta Holdings, the root of everything. I told them about the night I saw Nolan bring a stranger into the Marlowe, a man I recognized from one of Jamie's secret photographs. I described the tattoo, the way they spoke in low, pressed voices, the fragmented bits of conversation I had written down in my notebook. I told them about the undocumented crates, the unexplained disappearances, and the way Nolan always seemed to know everything before rumors even formed. I paused at the exact rhythm Evelyn had taught me, lifted my head, letting my eyes meet each of theirs. They didn't blink, didn't move, but I knew they were absorbing every detail. A gray-haired man with deep-set lines on his face and eyes that seemed to see beneath skin spoke next. "Can you confirm that Nolan Beckett was present in all transactions tied to Delta Holdings?" I kept my voice steady. "I have no signed documents, but my journal aligns with times, locations, and individuals involved." I heard him speak about payments routed through intermediaries. I saw him receive shipments with no paperwork, and I saw him meet the same individuals Jamie identified as key members. The man raised an eyebrow. "Did anyone else witness these things with you?" I shook my head. "No. They always chose moments when I was the only one present, or when they believed I was too insignificant to notice." Another woman, her voice rough as whetstone, cut in. "Then what made you stay? What kept you from looking away like everyone else?" "Jamie," I answered, my voice steady but aching, "because I refused to let his name be just a period in a forensic report. I'm not an investigator. I'm not a hero. But I was the last person he trusted, and I can't let that die with him." Silence pooled through the room. No pens scribbling, no recording devices. Yet I felt each of my words being weighed, documented, placed on an invisible scale. Another voice rose, this one from the edge of the room where the light reached only half of a man's face. "Are you prepared to repeat this testimony if the hearing advances to judgment, possibly in public, possibly before high-ranking officials?" I inhaled deeply, closed my eyes for a moment as if locking away fear. "I am, because if I do nothing, I will carry that guilt forever. Jamie did the hardest part. I'm only walking the rest of the way." A soft nod, like a signal of acceptance, broke the silence. No applause, no praise, only acknowledgement. But in a world where truth is buried under layers of power, being heard at all was a victory. Marcus had stood behind me the entire time, silent. But when I stepped off the platform and out of the spotlight, I felt his hand touch my back, not pushing, Not guiding, just there. And for the first time since Jamie died, I no longer felt alone. As I stepped down from the witness stand, the air in the circular room seemed to thicken, and though no one spoke, I could feel the undercurrent shifting. Marcus moved forward to take my place, bringing no notes or binders, only a small black hard drive he withdrew from his inner jacket pocket, placing it at the center of the room as if he were setting down the final piece in a game he'd been playing for months. He didn't introduce anything. He simply connected the device to the lone screen positioned before the council. The first image to appear was a financial transaction from a Swiss bank, dated to match one of Nolan Beckett's recorded trips nearly a year ago. Then came a series of surveillance images. Nolan meeting the tattooed man I had described, drone footage filmed from a distance, audio clips faint but clear enough to capture fragmented conversations about the transfer of unregistered cargo at the Tacoma docks. Marcus presented each part without haste, without urgency, his voice low and steady, like a somber score pulsing beneath the room. He wasn't merely showing evidence, he was mapping the architecture of Delta Holdings itself, from shell corporations to interstate money laundering routes to manipulation of public contract bids. The council didn't interrupt. They simply wrote notes, exchanged quiet, knowing glances, and listened. After nearly half an hour, one member finally spoke. "Have these documents been independently verified?" Marcus nodded. "All encrypted, stored on an internal network, corroborated by 3 independent sources, including a former auditor who remains anonymous." Another member asked, "Does Nolan Beckett know you collected these?" Marcus looked directly at him. "No. If he did, I wouldn't be standing here today, and Claire Dalton wouldn't have survived long enough to testify." My name cut through the room like a knock on a half-opened door. I was no longer someone standing on the outskirts, I had become a vital link pulling the curtain aside. One council member, for the first time since the hearing began, removed his glasses, set them on the table, and folded his hands. "In your view, how far has Nolan reached into the system?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Far enough that if we don't sever him now, he will pull in at least 3 legislators and 2 senior figures in finance. He's no longer a pawn. He's climbing to be a player." Silence settled again. Then the presiding member, the silver-haired woman who had opened the session, nodded, lifted a slim silver pen, and wrote something on the page before her. It was the signal for the next phase, the vote. A narrow panel slid out from the center of the round table. One by one, each member placed their ballot into the small slot. No words exchanged, no glances. It unfolded with a quiet so cold it raised goosebumps along my arms. I didn't dare breathe too hard. I watched the hands rise, lower, settle. After a few minutes, the panel retracted, and an assistant entered to retrieve the ballots, disappearing into a small adjoining room. Less than 10 minutes later, she returned and gave a single nod to the presiding member. The woman unfolded the ballots and read them with no shift of expression. 10 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. None opposed. My knees almost buckled with relief. Marcus remained still, expression unchanged, yet I knew he had just released a silent breath of his own. Nolan Beckett was officially placed under deep investigation, his assets frozen, and within 72 hours he would be summoned before the council. Surveillance orders went into effect immediately, severing every connection he had to Marlowe and Delta. When we stepped out of the circular room, night had fully fallen, wind off the lake chilling to the bone, but I had never felt lighter. "Jamie, at last, we had carried your truth across the distance you never got to. Finish." 3 days after the hearing at the lakeside mansion, I was summoned back not to testify this time, but to witness the result of what Jamie had paid for with his life. The circular room was unchanged, the wooden chairs still cold, the lights still fixed upon the podium in the center. But now, standing beneath that light, was Nolan Beckett, dressed in the same immaculate suit, hair neatly combed, his face emotionless, though I could see a faint tremor of fear behind his eyes. The Council of 12 sat as before, without greetings or ceremony. All evidence had been reviewed. All testimony had been recorded. Only one task remained, to determine the fate of the man who once led me to believe my brother's death had been a meaningless accident. The presiding woman, the silver-haired figure whose gaze carried the stillness of a frozen lake, announced that the final vote would begin. Nolan was given the right to speak, and he did. He denied everything. He twisted logic, rewrote narratives, tried to paint the entire case as a tapestry of misunderstandings woven by old enemies and internal conspiracies. But each word was like a dull blade scraping against the wall Marcus and I had built from blood, grief, and sleepless nights. The council didn't interrupt, but their faces were unyielding as carved stone. When Nolan fell silent, Marcus stepped forward not to present anything new, but to speak a single sentence, his voice ringing clear and resonant like a final toll of a bell. Jamie Dalton did not take his own life. He was murdered. And this is the man who signed that sentence. Silence swept through the room. The voting panel slid out again. One by one, the hands rose, placed ballots, withdrew. I clenched my hands together so tightly my nails pressed into my palms, but I didn't let go. I needed to witness this. I needed to see justice exist just once. 12 votes in favor, no abstentions, no opposition. Nolan Beckett was expelled from the system, his assets seized, his power stripped. He would be held in a secured facility, and his name would vanish from all official records. That was how the council dealt with traitors. No spotlight, no press briefings, no courtroom theatrics. Only darkness reclaiming those who had abused it. As Nolan was escorted out, his gaze flicked toward me a fleeting moment when he seemed poised to speak but no words came. And I no longer needed to hear any. I stood there, my legs trembling but my heart beating with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. A wave of emotion swelled in my chest as the room emptied, as Marcus placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, as Evelyn nodded quietly from across the space. I turned away, tears spilling freely. Not from pain, but because at last, truth had prevailed. Jamie, my brother, the one who taught me to believe in what is right, could finally rest. I had kept my promise. I had refused to let him die in silence. And for the first time since losing him, I felt him there beside me, bearing witness to it all. Justice is not something money or power can command. It lives only when someone has the courage to stand for another. And today, justice carried a name. Jamie Dalton. Dawn was just beginning to loosen its grip on the night when we left the lakeside estate, the first faint light seeping through the thin veil of mist that clung to the path. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands still numb from the long strain, my eyes following the blurred silhouettes of trees drifting past the window, my mind strangely empty after everything that had happened. There was no sound except the soft hum of tires rolling across the damp road, and in that silence, I could finally feel how exhausted my body truly was. But it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that breaks a person. It was the kind that comes after surviving a storm and finding solid ground beneath your feet again. Marcus remained quiet in his familiar way, one hand steady on the wheel, his gaze locked on the road ahead, though I knew his thoughts were carrying a weight deeper than anything he would ever say aloud. We didn't need to speak. Everything that mattered had already been proven by what we had done. Justice for Jamie was no longer a distant dream, it was something I had watched unfold with my own eyes. The car turned down a narrow road toward the northern edge of the city, where the safe house stood like a small, self-contained world untouched by the chaos outside. When we parked behind it, Marcus switched off the engine but didn't step out right away. Instead, he turned toward me, and for the first time, his eyes were no longer sharp steel but softened, as though he was seeing me not as a witness, not as Jamie's sister, but as someone who had walked through fear, stood before her brother's killer, and demanded justice. You did better than I expected. His voice was low, unembellished, but those words, small as they were, tightened something in my throat. I tried to smile, but all I managed was a small nod as I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying the heartbeat that was finally settling after months of living on the edge. Inside the house, everything was exactly as we'd left it. The kitchen light still dim and warm, the armchair by the window carrying the faint scent of last night's coffee. I slipped off my dust, speckled shoes and sat down, staring out the window where dawn was slowly brushing a new palette across the sky. No traffic, no voices, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the rare, quiet sense of safety I hadn't felt since Jamie died. Marcus poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of me, and sat across the table. We didn't speak. We simply existed in the same room, 2 people who had stepped out of a nightmare, not yet certain what tomorrow would bring but grateful that, at least for now, nothing was threatening us. I leaned back, closed my eyes for a brief moment, and for the first time in months, Jamie's face didn't appear, in the shadows behind my eyelids. Instead, I saw him standing across the lake, nodding at me with a faint smile like morning mist. Marcus rose first, walked to the doorway, then paused. "Get some rest. Tomorrow night, we'll talk. There are things I think you should know." He didn't wait for my reply. He simply walked out, leaving me alone with the warm glass of water and a strange, almost fragile sense of peace. As I watched the door close behind him, I realized that what made me feel safe wasn't the safe house walls or the security systems, but his quiet, unshakable presence. The man who had read every page of the journal I'd hidden, believed me when no one else did, and walked with me through the line between justice and darkness. And in that moment, I understood. The storm had passed, but the road ahead was still long. The following evening, when I came downstairs, my hair still damp, after a long shower meant to wash away everything heavy, Marcus was already seated at the table with a thick file tied neatly with a black cloth band. He didn't look up when I entered. He simply pushed the file toward me with the calmness of someone offering a dinner menu. "You should see this before I say anything else." I sat across from him, my fingers still cool from the water, and opened the file slowly. Inside were copies of contracts, invoices, and payment receipts from 3 different collection agencies, every one of them carrying my name. The crushing medical loans from the surgery that saved my life 3 years ago, the interest rates that had buried me, the final warnings I had been hiding in my drawer because I could never earn enough to clear them. One name repeated under payer on every page, M.V. Albrecht. I lifted my head, my pulse quickening. Marcus held my gaze without flinching. "I knew you'd never ask. And I didn't do this for gratitude. But I don't want you thinking you owe me anything. Everything has been taken care of. Even the burdens you thought you'd carry for the rest of your life." I placed my hand lightly on the papers, trying to steady my voice, even as it threatened to break. "You didn't have to do this. I could have." Marcus cut in with a small shake of his head. "Not because you couldn't, but because no one should have to start over carrying a weight like that." He stood, crossed to a cabinet, and retrieved another envelope. Inside were documents, legal name change certifications, a new bank account under the name Claire D. Monroe, and a temporary identification card with a new federal number. "I contacted someone I trust in the security service. Everything is clean. You can walk away from here whenever you choose and start again anywhere. A small coastal town, a big city, any life you want." For a moment, I couldn't react at all. It felt like stepping into a dream Jamie once painted for me, that if he survived his case, he'd help me shed every burden that had caged me for years. Now Marcus was the one making that picture real. But another part of me, quieter and deeper, kept circling the question I couldn't voice. Why would he do all this for me? Marcus seemed to read it in my eyes. He leaned back against the table, hands loosely clasped. "Jamie saved me once from a purge I shouldn't have survived. No one knows that but the 2 of us. I thought I'd never have the chance to repay it. But when I saw you walk into Marlowe, with eyes so much like his, I knew I had a responsibility, not because of debt, but because of trust." I sat in silence for a long moment, then nodded softly. There were no words large enough for what he'd done. All I could promise was that if I ever had the chance to live a new life, I'd make it count. I looked at Marcus, truly looked, and for the first time, saw not the powerful, cold figure who had helped me expose my brother's killer, but a man carrying his own unspoken losses. And that was what made him a kind of anchor I never expected. When I finally asked, "What about you? Have you started over?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He simply let one corner of his mouth lift, a half-smile tinged with something like regret. "Maybe starting over doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe it just means learning to live with what can't be undone. And sometimes, to do that, you need someone willing to stand beside you, even if it's just in silence." I sat alone in the small room by the window, the last light of the day tinting the papers spread before me in a soft gold, each document carrying the possibility of a life veering in a completely different direction. A new name, a new city, a spotless history so clean no one could ever trace the old trail back to me. It was everything I once believed I would sacrifice anything to have. Yet now, with all of it lying right in front of me, I hesitated. A life without fear was something I hadn't known since the day Jamie died. Even before that, when the weight of old debts gnawed at my peace piece by piece, when the bills piled higher than my hope, when rejection letters became the only familiar sound I lived with, Fear had been the only thing steady enough to cling to in order to survive. Now it was gone, and in its place was a hollow space that made me unsteady. Marcus knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside, not waiting for an invitation. He carried 2 cups of hot tea, set one in front of me, then pulled out the chair across from mine. No files, no weapons, no distance. Just a man and a woman sitting in a silence that understood more than words ever could. He didn't ask if I had decided. He only said, in that same low, steady voice of his, but softer now, closer somehow. You don't owe me, don't owe Jamie, don't owe anyone. You have the right to choose. Leave. If you want a completely new beginning, walk away from all of this. Never look back. Stay, if you believe there is something left for you to finish. Whatever you choose, I won't stand in your way. I looked at Marcus for a long time. He didn't bow his head or push me. His gaze met mine straight, honest, so steady I had to look away. He was giving me freedom. Completely. And that made the decision even harder. I thought about the nights behind the bar at Marlowe, when I still didn't know the truth. When the only things that mattered were the soft jazz, the scent of bourbon, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke clinging to the air. I thought about the diary I once hid so carefully, certain I would bury it forever, only to see it become the key that opened the door to an entire web of lies. I thought about Jamie, and how what he left behind wasn't only pain, but the strength to get up again. If I left, I could live a life no one could touch, a life without nightmares, without the constant need to glance over my shoulder, where I could walk into a bookstore, choose a worn novel, and read it on a balcony without fear. But would I truly be living, or only hiding? Marcus stood after my silence stretched too long. He didn't rush me. He simply placed a hand on the back of my chair, so lightly I felt only the warmth of it passing through the air. Tomorrow I'll be out of the city for a few days. Evelyn will stay if you need anything. And the decision, let time answer that. Then he left, leaving me alone with the steaming cup of tea and 100 thoughts running circles in my mind. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind slipping through the doorframe. For the first time, I didn't feel forced to give an answer right away. No pressure, no deadlines, just me and the choice. And whether I stayed or left, I knew that this time, I would choose not out of fear, but because finally I could choose the thing that made me feel free. I woke before dawn, the room still wrapped in the gentle gray of early morning, the quiet so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. I had lain awake for hours the night before, not reading the documents, not opening my computer, only staring at the ceiling and thinking about something I had never allowed myself to consider before. I no longer wanted to just survive. I wanted to live with purpose, not running, not hiding, but existing in a way that meant something. I stepped out onto the back porch, a thin blanket around my shoulders, the tea from last night cool in my hands, my bare feet pressing into the warm wooden boards. The sun was lifting slowly in the east, threading between the trees and glimmering across the still surface of the lake. I saw Marcus from a distance, standing at the edge of the woods, his back turned to me. He didn't know I was watching. He wasn't performing, wasn't guarding anything. He just stood there, alone, with his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture quiet and contemplative. And in that moment, I realized there was something larger than all the fear that had held me for so many years. I didn't want to leave this place. Not because of debt, not because of promises, but because I believed I could begin here. I trusted Marcus's presence the way one trusts a steady lighthouse in a storm. Not loud, not demanding, but there. And I trusted myself, for the first time, after everything. When I stepped closer, he didn't turn, but he knew I was there. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, making my thoughts clearer than they'd felt in years. I stopped beside him, my fingers tight around the cup of cold tea. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice soft but firm. Marcus turned to look at me, not surprised, only silent as if he had known all along. "I don't want to survive one more time. I want to make something new. And I think, if there's any place to start, maybe it's here." Marcus nodded, barely, the kind of small gesture that meant acceptance not just of my words, but of the choice I'd made for my own life. There was nothing left to say, no need for promises. He spoke only one sentence, "Then we'll build from the ground up." I met his eyes, for the first time without caution, without doubt. I saw a man who had lost more than I had imagined, a man who didn't run from the darkness but learned how to live beside it, and perhaps learning to trust someone was also a way to begin again. As we walked back toward the house, the sunlight spilled across the porch, stretching our shadows along the wooden wall like a quiet punctuation mark. No one knew what would come next. But this time, I wouldn't be facing it alone, and I wouldn't let my life shrink back into mere survival. I sat at the small table by the window, the morning light gliding through the thin curtain, slipping into the cracks of the old wooden walls and settling on the open blank page before me. The fountain pen in my hand had been dry for years, yet its weight felt familiar, as if all this time I had only been waiting for this exact moment to hold it again. The brown leather journal I once hid at the bottom of a drawer, the thing that placed me in Marcus's path, was open once more, but this time, not to write whispers of fear, this time, to begin something new. I wrote the date at the top of the page, my hand trembling slightly, not from worry, but from emotion. How long had it been since I last wrote for myself? How long since I stopped living in the echoes of other people, in Jamie's unfinished stories, in the silent conversations between me and those I would never face again? Now I was not writing for the past. I was writing because I still had a future. I wrote about the morning by the lake when I saw Marcus's silhouette standing in the early fog, about how he hadn't asked why I stayed, only accepted my presence as if it naturally belonged to the life slowly forming here. I wrote about the kitchen with its scent of toasted bread and the soft whistle of the kettle every morning, about the quiet afternoons on the porch reading old books, about the feeling of not having to look over my shoulder for the first time in my life. I wrote about the silence that no longer terrified me, about the days without warnings, without collectors, without hospitals sending letters I couldn't bear to open. I wrote about Marcus not as a symbol of power or the fearsome man I once heard rumors of, but as someone who knew when to be silent, who listened without needing to speak, who offered exactly what someone needed without making them beg. I wrote about Jamie, not only as pain anymore, but as the light in me, the one who carried me all the way to the threshold of a life he never had the chance to walk into. I wrote to keep all these new things alive inside me, like small shoots rising from soil that had once been burned barren. And when the first page filled with slanted lines of ink, I didn't close the journal as I always had. I left it open on the table, letting the sunlight rest on each word, reminding me that I was still here, and I was writing my life forward not out of fear, but out of choice. Writing not to recount what was lost, but to build what I would create. Not for Jamie, not for Marcus, but for myself, Claire Monroe, a new name, a new page. And for the first time, the voice inside me no longer whispered, "Can I survive?" But instead, "What will I do next with this life of mine?" That afternoon, Marcus took me to the top floor of a glass tower at the edge of downtown, a place where the walls were no longer made of brick or concrete but entirely of glass, opening into a sweeping view as if the world itself had unfolded beneath our feet. He said nothing on the way up, only pressed the elevator button with one hand in his pocket, eyes fixed ahead the way they always were, though something in his posture had softened, less guarded, less cold. When the doors slid open, I followed him into a wide, quiet space flooded with natural light from ceiling to floor, the furnishings simple but elegant, everything tidy, calm, so still you could almost hear a pin drop. "This is yours if you want it." His voice drifted through the air like wind across a lake, carrying no pressure, no persuasion. I walked slowly toward the glass wall overlooking the city, where buildings layered upon one another like stacked memories, where the winding streets resembled the choices I'd once stumbled through. Far in the distance, the river curved around the edge of the skyline, reflecting the fierce red of the setting sun. Marcus stood beside me, not too close, not too far as if he knew exactly how much space I needed to breathe, yet stayed close enough that I didn't feel alone. I turned toward him, intending to say something, but no words seemed clear enough. He met my gaze, tilting his head slightly, waiting, not urging. "Why here?" I asked. His answer came after a few quiet seconds, as though he weighed each word before offering it. "Because from here, you can see everything. What you've been through, and every place you could go next." I looked back at the view, the city softening beneath the twilight, quieter somehow, as if it too was learning to breathe slower. I had never imagined myself living in a place like this, where constant worry didn't hum beneath every sound, where the ring of a phone didn't break me open each time it echoed. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about everything I could build again. I thought about mornings by the window, picking up my journal to write the chapters I hadn't yet dared to imagine. I thought about opening a small cafe on a quiet street corner, where no one knew my name, where I could watch people pass by and feel, in some gentle and ordinary way, that I was still alive. Marcus placed the apartment key on the small table by the window. If you choose to stay, it's yours. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But I think you already know what you want. He didn't wait for my answer. He simply stood there beside me, looking out at the city one more time, and in that quiet moment, I realized I didn't need to decide immediately. I had already chosen life, and the rest, I would write day by day, not out of fear, not for anyone else, but for myself, Claire Monroe. Standing at the highest point once again, not for power or revenge, but because for the first time, I could see my life opening in front of me, and this time, I would be the one to write the next lines. I stood alone in the sunlit apartment, the city's hum rising from below like a familiar symphony that no longer made me feel small or lost. The glass doors were open, and the June wind drifted in, carrying the scent of exhaust, the warmth of life unfolding on the streets. Every horn, every footstep, every passing car reminded me that I was here breathing, existing, and for the first time in years, I was not living in fear. I was Claire Monroe, no longer the old name that chained me to a broken past, no longer the quiet bartender in a place where everyone had something to hide. I was someone learning how to live, learning to write the next part of her story out of choice rather than survival. I had lost so much to reach this day, my brother. My illusions about justice, the innocence that once convinced me that living decently was protection enough. But I gained things far more precious along the way. I found the truth. I found trust. I found myself again in the pages of a journal that had once been the only place I dared to be honest. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It pushes us forward even when we don't know where we're going. And sometimes, the only thing we can do is keep moving, even if it's one small step at a time, even in the dark, as long as we don't stop. Now I know no one can write my story but me. No past can bind me unless I let it. No loss can define me unless I hand it that power. I am the only one who can decide what tomorrow will look like. I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. I am done, living only to survive. I will live to build something meaningful. And if you're listening to this, perhaps you too are standing at a crossroads. Perhaps you've been afraid, betrayed, overlooked, feeling like a faint shadow in a world too loud to notice you. But I want you to remember this. There is always a chance to begin again, no matter how dark your past may feel. As long as you still have the courage to stand. As long as you still believe you deserve something better. What do you think of Claire's story? Does it remind you of someone or a moment in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, your true, honest feelings. We always want to hear your heart. If this story touched you or gave you something meaningful, please like and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next heartfelt, inspiring stories we bring to you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Wishing you good health, joy, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.